The frozen winds of Krell 7 cut through the protective suits like invisible knives as Lieutenant Jake Morrison led his team across the barren wasteland. The planet had been dead for millions of years according to the initial scans, but something about this place felt different to him. The snow beneath their boots crunched with each step, and the dim light from the distant red sun cast long shadows across the ice plains. Jake stopped at the edge of a massive crater and looked down at the structure jutting out from centuries of accumulated frost. Dr. Linda Hayes moved beside him with her scanning equipment held high. The readings made no sense to her trained eyes. Every instrument showed conflicting data, as if the structure below existed in multiple states simultaneously. She had spent 12 years studying alien ruins across the frontier worlds, but nothing had prepared her for this. The obsidian surface of the building seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a void in the white landscape that hurt to look at directly. Jake ordered the team to descend into the crater using their rappelling gear. The drop was nearly 200 meters, and the wind threatened to slam them against the crater walls with each gust. Private Kenny Lane went first, his boots finding purchase on the icy slope as he worked his way down. Sophie Cross followed next, her engineering background making her movements precise and calculated. One by one, the 12-person team descended until they all stood before the entrance to the ancient structure. The doorway had no visible mechanism or control panel. Linda ran her gloved hand across the smooth surface and felt a subtle vibration beneath her touch. She pulled out a molecular scanner and watched as it flickered and died the moment it came within a meter of the structure. Jake tried his own equipment with the same results. Whatever technology the builders had used, it was beyond anything humanity had encountered in their 3 centuries of space exploration. Sophie suggested using a plasma cutter to breach the entrance, but before she could deploy her equipment, the door simply opened. No sound accompanied the movement. The massive obsidian panel slid upward into a hidden recess, revealing a corridor that stretched into absolute darkness. Jake clicked on his helmet light and took the first step inside. The temperature increased immediately, rising from -40 degrees to a comfortable 20 within seconds. The team exchanged glances but continued forward. The corridor led them deep into the heart of the structure. Strange symbols lined the walls, glowing with a faint blue luminescence that pulsed like a heartbeat. Linda recorded everything with her backup cameras, knowing that whatever they found here would rewrite human understanding of galactic history. The symbols seemed to shift and change when observed directly, making it impossible to focus on any single character for more than a moment. After walking for nearly 20 minutes, the corridor opened into a vast chamber. The ceiling rose hundreds of meters above them, lost in shadow despite their lights. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and resting upon it was the blade. Jake felt his breath catch in his throat as he approached it. The weapon was nearly 2 meters long, forged from a material that seemed to shift between metal and crystal depending on the angle of observation. Glyphs covered every centimeter of its surface, identical to those on the corridor walls but somehow more intense and purposeful. Linda approached with her handheld recorder running. She circled the pedestal 3 times, documenting every detail while muttering observations into her audio log. Sophie tried to scan the weapon with her engineering tools, but like everything else in this place, the instruments failed upon contact. Kenny stood guard at the entrance, while the rest of the team spread out to explore the chamber's perimeter. They found no other artifacts, no remains, no clues about who had built this place or why. Jake reached out slowly and placed his hand on the blade's hilt. The material felt cold and smooth, but nothing happened. No lights, no sounds, no response of any kind. He tried to lift it, but the weapon remained fixed to the pedestal as if welded in place. Linda suggested they might need to activate some kind of security protocol or solve a puzzle to release it. They spent the next hour examining every surface, every symbol, every crack in the floor, but found nothing that resembled a control mechanism. Frustrated, Jake leaned heavily against the pedestal and felt a sharp pain in his palm. He pulled his hand back and saw blood welling from a clean cut, where the blade's edge had sliced through his glove. The wound was shallow but bleeding freely. Before he could react, 3 drops of blood fell onto the weapon's surface. The moment the crimson droplets made contact, everything changed. The blade erupted with light so bright that everyone in the chamber had to shield their eyes. The glyphs blazed with white fire, and a sound like distant thunder filled the air. Jake felt the weapon pulse beneath his hand, and suddenly he could move it. The blade lifted easily from the pedestal as if it weighed nothing at all. Energy coursed up his arm and into his chest, and his mind filled with images he could not fully comprehend. He saw stars dying and being born. He witnessed vast fleets of ships in battle formation. He felt the presence of something ancient and powerful watching him with curiosity. The visions lasted only seconds but felt like hours. When they faded, Jake found himself on his knees with the blade clutched in both hands. The weapon had changed. The glyphs now glowed with a steady blue light, and he could feel it responding to his thoughts. When he focused on standing, the blade seemed to help him rise as if it were supporting his weight. Linda rushed to his side and began scanning him with her medical equipment, relieved to find his vital signs stable despite the obvious strain on his face. The rest of the team gathered around as Jake explained what he had experienced. The blade was not just a weapon, but something far more sophisticated. It had been waiting, dormant for countless millennia, for the right catalyst to awaken it. Human blood had provided that catalyst, but Jake suspected it was more than just biology. The weapon had tested him somehow, examined his consciousness, and found him worthy or at least acceptable as a wielder. Sophie noticed something troubling. The chamber's walls had begun to display new symbols, these ones moving and animated like a projection. Linda recorded everything while trying to translate the alien script. The message was complex, but certain elements became clear through repetition and context. The weapon was called the Blade, and it had been created by a civilization known as the Architects. They had fought something terrible, something that threatened all life in the galaxy, and they had created this weapon as part of their defense. Jake felt the blade pulse again, and another wave of images flooded his mind. He saw darkness spreading across star systems like ink and water. He witnessed entire planets going silent and cold. He felt the hunger of something vast and incomprehensible, something that existed between the spaces of normal reality. The Architects had fought this enemy to a standstill and sealed it away, but at a cost that had destroyed their entire civilization. The Blade and others like it were their legacy, their final hope that some future species might be able to finish what they had started. Captain Helen Price's voice crackled over the radio, breaking Jake's concentration. The Valiant had detected unusual energy signatures coming from their position, and she wanted the team to return to the ship immediately for debriefing. Jake looked down at the blade in his hands and knew with absolute certainty that bringing this weapon aboard would change everything. Whatever the Architects had fought, whatever they had sealed away, humanity was about to inherit their war whether they wanted to or not. The medical bay of the Valiant hummed with activity as doctors ran every test they could think of on Jake Morrison. 3 days had passed since they returned from Krell 7, and the blade remained bonded to him in a way that defied scientific explanation. The weapon sat in a specially constructed containment field nearby, but it only activated when Jake held it. Every attempt by other crew members to touch it resulted in the same outcome. The blade remained inert and impossibly heavy, as if it were made of neutron star material. Dr. Linda Hayes had barely slept since returning to the ship. Her quarters were filled with data screens showing translations of the Architect symbols, and progress was painfully slow. The language operated on principles that seemed more mathematical than linguistic, with each symbol containing layers of meaning that shifted based on context and position. She had managed to decode roughly 8% of the text they had recorded, but what she had learned filled her with growing dread. Jake sat on the edge of his bunk in the isolation quarters Captain Helen Price had assigned him. The dreams came every night now, vivid and overwhelming. He walked through cities of impossible architecture where beings of pure light moved with purpose and grace. He watched as these architects gathered in vast assemblies, their forms shifting and changing as they debated in a language he somehow understood. They spoke of duty and sacrifice, of a threat that had emerged from the spaces between realities, of an enemy that consumed everything it touched. The Devourers appeared in his dreams as entities that hurt to perceive. They existed partially outside normal space, their true forms incomprehensible to minds evolved in 3 dimensions. Jake saw them approach an architect world and felt the terror of billions as the creatures began to feed. They drained energy from stars themselves, collapsing suns into frozen husks within hours. Planets died not from destruction, but from the complete absence of heat, light, and even atomic motion. Life simply ceased as if someone had turned off the fundamental forces of the universe. Commander Greg Palmer entered the isolation quarters with a data pad clutched tightly in his hand. His face was pale, and his usual confident demeanor had cracked. He handed the pad to Jake without speaking, and waited as the lieutenant read the intelligence report. 12 human colonies along the outer rim had gone completely silent over the past 3 weeks. No distress signals, no evacuation attempts, nothing. Survey ships sent to investigate found the same horror at each location. Frozen worlds where every star in the system had gone dark and cold. Jake felt the blade pulse from across the room, responding to his spike of adrenaline and fear. The weapon knew what those reports meant, even if humanity did not yet fully comprehend the danger. The seals were breaking. The prison the architects had constructed 10 million years ago was failing, and the Devourers were returning to finish what they had started. Greg explained that Captain Price had called an emergency meeting with the Alliance Council, and Jake was required to attend via secure transmission. The council chamber appeared on the main view screen in the isolation quarters, filled with representatives from every major human colony and Earth itself. Ambassador Claire Foster spoke first, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. She wanted immediate evacuation of all Outer Rim territories and a full military mobilization to defend the core worlds. Military Director Paul Wright countered that abandoning the frontier would only buy them months at best, and running from an enemy they did not understand was the fastest path to extinction. Jake listened as the council members argued, their voices rising in pitch and desperation. Then Captain Price called on him to explain what he had learned from the blade. He stood before the camera and chose his words carefully. The weapon was not just a tool but a repository of architect knowledge and memory. It had shown him their history, their war, and their ultimate sacrifice. The architects had created 7 weapons, each designed to combat the Devourers in different ways. The blade was only one piece of a larger arsenal, and without the others, humanity stood no chance of survival. The council chamber fell silent as Jake described what the Devourers could do. Traditional weapons were useless against them because they existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Conventional energy shields could not block their feeding process. Even destroying a planet they were attacking would accomplish nothing, because the Devourers did not consume matter, but the fundamental energy that held reality together. The only reason the architects had succeeded in sealing them away was through weapons like the blade that could interact with multiple dimensions at once. Ambassador Foster asked the question everyone was thinking. If the architects with all their advanced technology had barely won by sacrificing their entire civilization, what chance did humanity have with only one weapon and no understanding of how to use it properly? Jake felt the blade pulse again, and suddenly he knew the answer. The architects had not expected their seals to last forever. They had known eventually the Devourers would return. The weapons were designed to be found by whatever species had evolved to prominence in the galaxy. The test was simple. Could that species unite and fight for survival, or would they fracture and fall? Dr. Linda Hayes appeared on screen from her laboratory, her eyes red from exhaustion but bright with discovery. She had found something crucial in the architect records. The coordinates to the second weapon were hidden in the mathematical structure of the symbols themselves. It would take time to calculate the exact location, but she estimated they could have it within 48 hours. More importantly, she had discovered that each weapon required a different type of wielder. The blade had chosen Jake, but the other weapons would bond with individuals who possessed specific mental and emotional characteristics. Captain Price made the decision that would define humanity's response to the crisis. The Valiant would become a mobile base for hunting down the remaining 6 weapons. They would recruit the finest specialists from every field and begin training a team capable of wielding architect technology. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only option that offered any hope of victory rather than mere survival. The council gave their reluctant approval, knowing they had no better alternative. Jake spent the next 2 days training with the blade under the supervision of the ship's combat instructors. The weapon responded to his intentions more than his physical movements. When he thought about defense, the blade generated fields of energy that could deflect projectiles and absorb impacts. When he focused on offense, the edge became sharp enough to cut through reinforced hull plating like paper, but each use left him drained and shaking, his body struggling to channel the immense power the weapon generated. Sophie Cross volunteered to help with the training sessions, using her engineering knowledge to design scenarios that would push Jake to his limits. She noticed something the combat instructors had missed. The blade was not just responding to Jake's conscious thoughts but to his deeper emotions and instincts. When he felt protective of his crewmates during simulations, the weapon's defensive capabilities increased dramatically. When he faced simulated threats to innocent civilians, the offensive power surged beyond what should have been possible for someone with only days of experience. Linda finally completed the calculations and transmitted the coordinates to the bridge. The second weapon was located on a shattered moon, orbiting a dead star in the Epsilon sector, nearly 4 weeks away at maximum speed. Captain Price ordered the ship to jump immediately, knowing that every hour of delay meant more colonies falling silent and more lives lost to the Devourers. The Valiant's engines thrummed to life, and the ship accelerated out of orbit around Krell 7. Jake stood in the observation deck and watched the stars shift as they entered faster than light travel. The blade rested in its containment field beside him, its glyphs pulsing with steady blue light. He could feel it in his mind now, a presence that was neither friendly nor hostile but simply waiting. The weapon had been patient for 10 million years, and it would continue to wait until its wielder was truly ready. Jake wondered if he would live long enough to reach that point, or if, like the architects before him, he would have to sacrifice everything just to give humanity a chance at survival. The dreams that night were different. Instead of showing him the past, the blade showed him possibilities. He saw himself standing alongside other wielders, each carrying one of the 7 weapons. He felt their minds touching his through some kind of shared connection. Together they faced the Devourers not as individuals but as a unified force, their weapons combining in ways that transcended the sum of their parts. It was a vision of hope, but Jake knew that reaching it would require finding 6 other people willing to bear the same burden he now carried. The hunt had begun, and failure meant the end of everything humanity had ever built or dreamed of becoming. The shattered moon of Epsilon 9 hung in space like a broken tooth, its surface torn apart by some ancient cataclysm that had left jagged mountains floating in loose formation. The Valiant approached slowly with sensors scanning every fragment for signs of the second weapon. Dr. Linda Hayes coordinated the search from the bridge, while Jake Morrison stood beside Captain Helen Price watching the debris field grow larger on the view screen. 4 weeks had passed since they left Krell 7, and in that time 6 more colonies had gone silent, their stars extinguished by the returning Devourers. The scanning team detected an energy signature buried deep within the largest fragment, a chunk of moon nearly 50 kilometers across. Sophie Cross prepared the landing shuttle with a full engineering team, while Jake checked his equipment one final time. The blade hung at his side in a custom harness that Sophie had designed, and he could feel it humming with anticipation. Whatever waited below, the weapon recognized it as kin. The landing was rough due to the unstable gravity fields created by the fragmented moon. Sophie piloted the shuttle through a canyon that cut deep into the moon's interior. Following the energy readings that grew stronger with every kilometer, they found the entrance to an architect facility carved into the canyon wall, its obsidian surface identical to the structure on Krell 7. The door opened at their approach without any prompting, as if the facility had been expecting them. Inside, they discovered a circular chamber with walls covered in the same shifting glyphs Jake had seen in his dreams. But this time the symbols told a different story. Linda recorded everything while translating aloud. This facility had been a training ground where architect warriors learned to bond with their weapons. The second weapon rested on a pedestal in the center of the chamber, and it took the form of a gauntlet that covered the entire right arm from fingertips to elbow. The metal was silver rather than black, and it pulsed with a soft red glow that made the air around it shimmer with heat. Lieutenant Sophie Cross approached the gauntlet with curiosity, overcoming her usual caution. She had always been drawn to energy systems and power generation, spending her free time designing more efficient reactor configurations. Something about the gauntlet called to her in a way she could not explain. She reached out and touched the metal surface with her bare hand, and the weapon erupted with crimson fire. The bonding process was faster than it had been with Jake, but no less intense. Sophie screamed as the gauntlet flowed like liquid metal up her arm, forming itself to her exact proportions. Energy coursed through her nervous system, and she saw visions of architect engineers working to contain power sources that could fuel entire star systems. She felt their dedication to building rather than destroying. to creating shields and barriers that could protect billions of lives. When the visions faded, the gauntlet had become part of her, responding to her thoughts as naturally as her own hand. Jake helped Sophie to her feet and immediately felt a connection form between them through their weapons. The blade and the gauntlet recognized each other and began sharing information across the bond. He could sense Sophie's thoughts on the edge of his awareness, not reading her mind but feeling her emotional state and intentions. She experienced the same connection, and they both understood that this was how the 7 weapons were meant to function, as a unified system where each wielder supported the others. The team returned to the Valiant with their prize, but the celebration was cut short by an emergency transmission from Fleet Command. The mining colony of New Pittsburgh was under attack by something that matched the descriptions Jake had given of the Devourers. 3 Alliance warships had responded to the distress call, but their weapons were having no effect on the enemy. Captain Price ordered the ship to maximum speed, knowing they were still 2 days away, even pushing the engines beyond safe limits. Jake spent those 2 days in constant training with Sophie, learning how their weapons complemented each other. The gauntlet could generate and manipulate massive amounts of energy, creating barriers or focused beams that Sophie controlled with precision. The blade could cut through dimensions and strike at things that existed outside normal space. Together they discovered combinations that neither weapon could achieve alone. When Sophie created an energy field and Jake channeled it through the blade, they could project cutting edges across hundreds of meters. They arrived at New Pittsburgh to find a scene of horror beyond anything the crew had imagined. The system's star had dimmed to a dull red ember, and the planet below was already freezing as temperatures plummeted. The 3 Alliance warships drifted dead in space, their power cores completely drained. And at the center of it all hung the Devourer. The creature defied easy description. It appeared as a mass of writhing darkness that seemed to fold in on itself endlessly. Parts of it flickered in and out of existence as if it could not fully manifest in normal space. Energy flowed into it from every direction, pulled by some force that ignored physical laws. The star itself was slowly dying as the Devourer fed, drawing power directly from the nuclear fusion at its core. Captain Price wanted to evacuate the remaining colonists on the planet's surface, but long-range scans showed it was already too late. The colony was dark and silent, every heat signature extinguished. 200,000 people had died in the hours before the Valiant arrived. Jake felt rage building in his chest, and the blade responded to his emotion by blazing with blue fire hot enough that everyone on the bridge could feel the heat. Sophie placed her gauntleted hand on his shoulder, and the connection between their weapons created a moment of perfect clarity. They could not save New Pittsburgh, but they could prevent this from happening to other worlds. They could hurt this thing in a way that conventional weapons could not. Jake looked at Captain Price and requested permission to engage the enemy. The captain hesitated for only a moment before giving her approval, knowing that this was why they had sought the weapons in the first place. The Valiant launched a shuttle with Jake and Sophie aboard, piloted by Kenny Lane, who volunteered despite knowing the insane danger. They approached the Devourer slowly, and Jake extended his senses through the blade. The weapon allowed him to perceive the creature's true form, existing across multiple dimensions simultaneously. It was feeding not just on the star's energy, but on the fundamental forces that held space-time together. Left unchecked, it would eventually consume the entire system and move on to the next. Jake gripped the blade with both hands and focused his will. The weapon responded by cutting a rift in space, creating a pathway that existed in the same dimensional layer as the Devourer. Sophie channeled energy from the gauntlet into the blade, amplifying its power beyond what either weapon could generate alone. Together they struck at the creature's core, at the part of it that anchored its existence to this reality. The Devourer screamed, though the sound came not through air but directly into their minds. It was a noise filled with hunger and rage and something that might have been surprise. For the first time in millions of years, something had hurt it. The creature twisted in space and focused its attention on the tiny shuttle that dared to attack it. Jake felt the weight of its regard like a physical force trying to crush his consciousness, but the blade helped him resist. The battle that followed lasted only minutes, but felt like hours. Jake and Sophie worked in perfect coordination, their weapons creating combinations of cutting edges and energy fields that could strike across dimensions. The Devourer adapted quickly, shifting its form to avoid their attacks and trying to drain energy from the shuttle itself. Kenny pushed the engines to their limits, dodging and weaving through space while Jake and Sophie continued their assault. They could not kill the creature, not with only 2 weapons, but they could wound it severely. Jake found a weak point in the Devourer's dimensional anchor and drove the blade deep into it. Sophie poured all the energy she could channel into the strike, and for a moment the creature's form destabilized. It pulled back from the dying star and retreated through a rift in space, fleeing to recover from injuries it had not believed possible. The shuttle returned to the Valiant, and Jake collapsed the moment they were aboard. He had pushed himself beyond his limits and his body was paying the price. Sophie was in better condition but still needed medical attention for the strain of channeling so much energy. Dr. Linda Hayes treated them both while Captain Price reviewed the battle data. They had driven off 1 Devourer, but the scans showed at least a dozen more of the creatures spreading across the outer rim. Jake woke 3 days later in the medical bay with Linda sitting beside his bed. She had news that was both hopeful and terrifying. The architect records had revealed the locations of the remaining 4 weapons, but they were scattered across the galaxy. More importantly, she had translated a warning that made her blood run cold. The Devourers they were fighting now were only scouts, testing the strength of current galactic civilizations. The main force remained sealed in their dimensional prison, but if the scouts succeeded in draining enough energy, the seals would fail completely. Hundreds of Devourers would pour into normal space and nothing would survive. Sophie entered the medical bay still wearing the gauntlet, which had become as much a pari. The Valiant became a ship of purpose over the following months as Captain Helen Price assembled the finest specialists from across human space. Commander Greg Palmer arrived first, transferred from military intelligence with a reputation for analytical thinking and unshakable calm under pressure. The 3rd weapon waited on a frozen asteroid in the Darien Belt, and when they found it, the shield recognized Greg immediately. The moment his blood touched its surface, the circular barrier expanded and contracted around him like a living thing, teaching him how to deflect attacks that came from multiple dimensions simultaneously. Pilot Kenny Lane bonded with the 4th weapon on a planet consumed by volcanic activity. The spear was longer than he was tall, forged from metal that burned with inner fire. It granted him the ability to pierce through the fabric of space itself, creating portals that could transport matter instantaneously across vast distances. Kenny adapted to the weapon with frightening speed, his natural piloting skills translating perfectly to navigating the strange angles and impossible geometries the spear revealed to him. Dr. Nathan Cole had been treating the wounded from Devourer attacks for weeks when they found the 5th weapon in an underwater trench on an ocean world. The armor came to him in pieces that assembled themselves across his body, creating a second skin that glowed with soft golden light. It could heal injuries that should have been fatal, and even restore life to those who had just crossed the threshold of death. Nathan felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders as he realized the armor would force him to make terrible choices about who lived and who died. Navigator Lisa Grant was the last to join them, bonding with the 6th weapon during a rescue mission gone wrong. The helm fitted itself to her head and opened her perception to probability streams and potential futures. She could see the paths that led to survival and those that ended in destruction. The visions came constantly, overlapping and contradicting each other as every choice spawned new possibilities. Lisa learned to filter the noise and focus on the threads that mattered most. Together, the 6 wielders trained aboard the Valiant, pushing their weapons and themselves to the breaking point. Jake led the sessions, drawing on knowledge the blade fed directly into his mind. The weapons were designed to work as a unified system, and the wielders needed to learn how to fight not as individuals, but as extensions of each other. Sophie created energy fields that Greg shaped with his shield, while Kenny opened portals that allowed Nathan to reach wounded crew members instantly. Lisa guided them through training scenarios by seeing which tactics would succeed and which would lead to failure. The Devourers continued their advance, and 30 more colonies fell silent as the creatures spread across the outer rim. The Alliance Council grew desperate, with some members advocating surrender or appeasement. Ambassador Claire Foster proposed offering the Devourers uninhabited star systems in exchange for leaving human worlds alone. Military Director Paul Wright called her a fool and prepared the fleet for a last stand at Earth itself. The Council was fracturing just as Jake had feared, proving that humanity's greatest weakness was not military strength but unity of purpose. Dr. Linda Hayes spent every waking hour translating the architect records, and what she discovered shook her to her core. The seventh weapon was not missing, but hidden behind a trial that would test everything the wielders had learned. Its location was encoded in the combined resonance of the other 6 weapons, revealed only when they operated in perfect synchronization. She brought this information to Jake during a quiet moment in the observation deck while the ship traveled through hyperspace toward their next engagement. Jake listened to Linda's explanation and felt the weight of leadership pressing down on him. The other 5 wielders looked to him for guidance, trusting his connection to the blade and the knowledge it provided. But he was just a lieutenant who had stumbled into destiny by cutting his hand on an alien artifact. How could he lead humanity's last hope when he barely understood the forces they were fighting against? Linda placed a hand on his arm and reminded him that the architects had not chosen him for his rank or experience, but for something deeper that even he might not recognize in himself. The trial's location manifested 3 days later during a coordinated attack on a devourer threatening the colony of New Harmony. All 6 wielders engaged the creature simultaneously, their weapons resonating in harmony as they drove it back through its dimensional rift. In that moment of perfect unity, the weapons projected a star map directly into their shared consciousness. The 7th weapon waited at the galactic core, in a region of space so twisted and dangerous that no ship had ever returned from it. Captain Price called a meeting in the war room to discuss their options. The journey to the galactic core would take 3 weeks through the most hazardous stellar phenomena known to humanity. Gravitational anomalies, radiation storms, and spatial distortions made the region essentially impassable by conventional navigation. But Lisa's helm could see the safe path through the chaos, and Kenny's spear could create shortcuts when necessary. It was possible barely, but it would require perfect execution and more than a little luck. The decision was made to attempt the journey. But before they departed, Jake insisted on addressing the Alliance Council one final time. He stood before the assembled representatives via holographic transmission and spoke with conviction, born from months of fighting an enemy that wanted to consume everything humanity had built. The Devourers could not be reasoned with or appeased because they were not conquerors, but forces of nature, hunger given form and purpose. Running would only delay the inevitable, and surrender meant extinction not just for humanity, but for every species in the galaxy. Jake showed them recordings of the battles they had fought, the colonies they had failed to save, and the wounded survivors who had lost everything. He explained what the 7th weapon represented, not just power but the key to permanently sealing the Devourers away as the architects had done millions of years ago. This was not about human pride or territorial disputes, but about survival of life itself. Every species that had ever looked at the stars and wondered about their place in the universe was depending on humanity to succeed where the architects had sacrificed everything. Ambassador Foster stood and asked the question. Everyone wanted answered. What guarantee did they have that 6 humans with alien weapons could accomplish what an entire advanced civilization had barely managed? Jake met her eyes through the holographic display and gave the only honest answer he could. There were no guarantees, only the certainty of extinction if they did nothing. The architects had left their weapons because they believed some future species would be worthy of wielding them. Humanity had to prove that faith was not misplaced. The council voted to support the mission with the narrowest possible margin, but support was all Jake needed. The Valiant began preparations for the journey, while the 6 wielders spent every free moment training together. Sophie worked with Kenny to combine portals and energy projection. Greg and Nathan developed tactics where the shield could protect while the armor healed. Lisa coordinated everything by seeing which combinations worked and which led to disaster. Jake moved between them all, the blade serving as the anchor that kept their weapons synchronized. The ship departed from Alliance space with an escort of 12 warships that would accompany them as far as safely possible. Jake stood in the observation deck and watched the stars shift as they entered hyperspace. He could feel the other wielders through the connection their weapons created, their determination mixing with his own. Somewhere ahead in the roiling chaos of the galactic core, the 7th weapon waited. The heart, as the architect records called it, was the key to everything. The journey tested them in ways combat never had. Spatial distortions threw the ship off course. requiring Lisa to constantly recalculate their route, while Kenny opened emergency portals to bypass the worst anomalies. Radiation storms bombarded their shields, and Nathan's armor worked overtime healing crew members affected by exposure. Greg's shield expanded to protect vital ship systems when their conventional defenses failed. Sophie channeled energy to the engines when they needed extra power. Jake coordinated everything through the blade, feeling the strain of keeping 6 weapons and 6 minds working in harmony. 3 weeks later, they emerged from hyperspace at the coordinates the weapons had revealed. Before them hung a structure that made the facilities on Krell 7 and Epsilon 9 look like crude shelters. The Architect installation existed partially outside normal space, a pocket dimension anchored to reality by towers of impossible geometry. The escort warships held position at a safe distance while the Valiant approached alone. Jake gathered the other 5 wielders in the shuttle bay, and together they boarded a small craft that Kenny would pilot. They entered the installation through an opening that appeared in response to their weapons. Inside they found a vast maze that shifted and changed, walls moving to create new passages while closing off others. Lisa's helm showed her the correct path through the chaos, and they followed her guidance deeper into the structure. Each wielder faced manifestations of their deepest fears along the way. Jake confronted visions of Earth. The bonding with the heart was unlike anything the 6 wielders had experienced before. Jake felt his consciousness expand to touch the minds of Sophie, Greg, Kenny, Nathan, and Lisa in ways that went beyond simple communication. He could feel Sophie's analytical approach to problems, Greg's steady calm in crisis, Kenny's instinctive understanding of spatial relationships, Nathan's compassion for all living things, and Lisa's ability to see patterns in chaos. They remained individuals but were now connected at a level that made them capable of acting as one entity when needed. The heart transformed the other 6 weapons in response to the bonding. The blade in Jake's hands began to glow with colors that shifted through the spectrum, no longer just blue but containing aspects of all the other weapons. Sophie's gauntlet developed crystalline structures that resonated with the heart's energy. Greg's shield could now deflect attacks across dimensions with perfect precision. Kenny's spear burned with fire that could pierce reality itself. Nathan's armor gained the ability to heal not just bodies but damage to spacetime. Lisa's helm showed her not just possible futures but the exact path needed to reach the best outcome. They emerged from the installation to find the Valiant surrounded by devourers. Dozens of the creatures had converged on the location, drawn by the massive energy signature the heart generated during the bonding. Captain Helen Price had ordered the escort warships to engage, but conventional weapons were useless against so many enemies. 3 ships had already gone dark, their power cores drained completely. The remaining vessels fought desperately to buy time, but everyone aboard knew they were minutes away from total destruction. Jake stood at the shuttle's viewport and felt no fear, only clarity of purpose. The heart had shown him what needed to be done, and the other 5 wielders understood through their shared connection. They did not need to speak or plan because they could feel each other's intentions as clearly as their own thoughts. Kenny piloted the shuttle into the battle while the others prepared their weapons for the confrontation that would determine the fate of not just humanity but all life in the galaxy. The Devourers sensed the 7 weapons and turned their attention. From the warships to the tiny shuttle, the creatures moved through space like living shadows, their forms flickering between dimensions as they converged. Jake extended his senses through the blade and perceived their true nature for the first time, with complete understanding. They were not evil or malicious, but simply expressions of entropy, drawn to concentrations of energy the way gravity pulled matter together. They could no more choose to stop feeding than a black hole could decide to stop consuming. But understanding did not mean acceptance. The Devourers threatened everything the 6 wielders cared about, and the weapons gave them the power to fight back. Jake raised the blade and felt it respond not just to his will, but to the combined intention of all 6 wielders channeled through the heart. The weapon transformed, growing and shifting until it became something greater than a sword. It was a conduit for the power of all 7 architect weapons working in perfect harmony. Sophie fed energy into the construct through her gauntlet, vast amounts of power drawn from the heart itself. Greg shaped that energy with his shield, focusing it into a cutting edge that existed across multiple dimensions. Kenny opened portals with his spear, allowing the attack to strike from angles that should not exist in normal space. Nathan's armor protected the wielders from the backlash of channeling so much power. Lisa's helm showed Jake exactly where and when to strike for maximum effect. Together, they became a weapon system that the architects had designed but never fully realized. The first Devourer died permanently, its form dissolving across all dimensions as the combined weapon struck at its core. The creature's death scream echoed through space, carrying a note of surprise that something could actually end its existence. The other Devourers hesitated for the first time in their eternal hunger, recognizing a threat they could not simply overwhelm through numbers, but they were driven by instinct older than stars, and they attacked with renewed fury. The battle that followed would be recorded in history as the moment humanity proved itself worthy of its place among the stars. Jake and the others fought not as individuals but as a single consciousness operating 6 bodies and 7 weapons. They moved through the battlefield like dancers, each action flowing seamlessly into the next. Sophie created barriers of energy that Greg shaped into traps. Kenny opened portals that allowed them to appear anywhere on the battlefield instantly. Nathan healed damage as fast as the Devourers could inflict it. Lisa guided their every move by seeing which actions led to victory. The Valiant and the surviving escort ships provided support, their weapons useless against the Devourers but effective at destroying the smaller creatures that spawned from the main entities. Captain Price coordinated the fleet's movements while watching in awe as 6 humans with alien weapons fought against impossible odds. She had spent her entire career preparing for combat, but nothing had prepared her for this. The wielders were operating at a level beyond human capability, enhanced by their weapons and connection to each other. Hours passed in what felt like moments. Jake lost count of how many Devourers they destroyed, focused only on the next target and the next after that. His body should have been exhausted, but the armor kept him functioning while the heart provided endless reserves of power. The other wielders experienced the same sustained state, pushed beyond their limits but held together by their weapons and their connection. The tide began to turn when Jake realized the Devourers were not just attacking randomly but trying to create a dimensional rift large enough to bring through the main force still sealed in their prison. If they succeeded, hundreds more creatures would pour into normal space and even the 7 weapons would be overwhelmed. He shared this understanding with the others through the heart, and they immediately adapted their tactics. Instead of hunting individual Devourers, they focused on preventing the rift from opening. Lisa saw the critical moment approaching, a point where the dimensional barriers would either hold or collapse completely. She guided Jake to the exact location where he needed to strike, a weak point in reality that the Devourers were exploiting. Sophie channeled all the energy she could draw from the heart into the blade. Greg shaped it into a spear of pure force. Kenny opened a portal directly to the weak point. Nathan wrapped them all in his armor's protection. Together they struck with everything they had. The blade, empowered by all 7 weapons, pierced through dimensions and drove deep into the weak point. Jake felt the heart respond, recognizing what needed to be done. The crystal's power flowed through him and into the breach, weaving a seal that would hold permanently. The dimensional barriers that the architects had created millions of years ago were failing, but the heart could create new ones that would last forever. All it required was a catalyst, an anchor to bind the seal to this reality. Jake understood in that moment what the architects had always known. The 7 weapons were not meant to destroy the Devourers, but to seal them away permanently. The cost of that seal was everything the wielders had become, their connection through the weapons, their enhanced capabilities. Even the weapons themselves would have to be sacrificed to create a barrier strong enough to hold against entropy itself. He shared this knowledge with the others through the heart, giving them a choice. They could withdraw now, keep the weapons and continue fighting the Devourers one by one for as long as they survived, or they could sacrifice everything they had gained to save not just humanity, but all life in the galaxy. The decision had to be unanimous because the seal required all 7 weapons working in perfect harmony. Sophie answered first through the connection, her determination absolute. She had seen too many people die in the colonies the Devourers destroyed. Greg followed, his duty clear despite the personal cost. Kenny agreed without hesitation, already calculating how to position his portals for maximum effect. Nathan felt the weight of all the lives he could save through this choice. Lisa saw the future that would result from their sacrifice and knew it was the only path to survival. Jake thrust the heart into the dimensional weak point and released everything the 7 weapons had given them. The blade dissolved in his hands, its matter and energy flowing into the seal. Sophie's gauntlet, Greg's shield, Kenny's spear, Nathan's armor, and Lisa's helm followed, each weapon adding its unique properties to the barrier. The heart pulsed one final time and shattered, its fragments spreading across the dimensional barriers to reinforce them at every weak point. The Devourers screamed as the seals formed around them, cutting off their access to normal space. The creatures that had already crossed over found themselves trapped, unable to retreat to their dimensional prison or draw power from it. The wielders, working together one last time without their weapons, coordinated the fleet to destroy the remaining Devourers using conventional tactics. Without the connection to their prison, the creatures were vulnerable in ways they had never been before. The battle ended not with victory cries, but with exhausted silence. Jake woke in the Valiant's medical bay 3 months later, his body recovering from the strain of channeling power never numb.